Welcome to US Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: a lot of Americans embrace Trump's authoritarianism. EU funding delays imperil Ukraine's macro-financial stability, says official. Support slides for Ukraine in wake of Middle East war. Harris files paperwork putting Biden on South Carolina's ballot to kick off 2024's Democratic primary. How Democrats' abortion ads used personal stories, attacks to win voters. A lot of Americans embrace Trump's authoritarianism. Washington Post. Around 40% of Americans believe that the U.S. has veered so far off track that it needs a leader who will break rules to fix the country's direction, according to the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. The poll found that nearly 50% of Republicans agreed with the statement. The figures suggest that support for authoritarianism is a key factor in support for former President Donald Trump. A political scientist said he had identified support for authoritarianism as a key indicator of support for Trump among Republican primary voters in 2016. The PRRI poll also found that 49% of respondents would prefer Trump over President Joe Biden. A CNN poll found that, despite most respondents believing that Biden respected the rule of law and only a third believing the same of Trump, 14% of respondents thought Trump should be president. A majority of respondents said they would never support either Biden or Trump. EU funding delays imperil Ukraine's macro-financial stability, says official. Financial Times. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Stefanishina, has warned that the country's macro-financial stability is at risk due to delays in securing a fresh financial package from the EU. The EU has proposed a €50 billion, $59 billion, package to support Ukraine's finances for the next 4 years, but member states have been unable to agree on the proposal. The uncertainty over EU funding comes as the US has also failed to convince Congress to provide additional funding to Ukraine. Stefanishina stressed the need for clarity and funding by January to avoid disruption to Ukraine's financial stability. Support slides for Ukraine in wake of Middle East war. Spiegel. Ukraine is facing a difficult situation as progress on the front line has been limited, and Western military aid is needed to counter Russia's aggression. However, it is unlikely that such aid will be forthcoming, especially with the West's attention being diverted to the new war in the Middle East. The United States may even reduce its support, and the European Union would not be able to make up for the shortfall. Ukraine is heavily dependent on U.S. military aid, and the EU's financial aid would not be enough to compensate for the loss. Germany is proud to be the largest provider of military aid to Ukraine after the U.S., but its aid is not sufficient to ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose the war. The EU has pledged the largest sums of money to Ukraine, but when it comes to military assistance, the US is indispensable. Currently, the US has provided Ukraine with around €42 billion worth of armaments, more than all EU member states combined. The EU's financial aid to Ukraine is not in question, but there is dissent over the details. Most EU member states are struggling with their own budgets, and some prefer to reduce the share of gifts in the aid packages to make them more palatable domestically. War weariness is also spreading within the EU, and skepticism towards Ukraine is particularly widespread in Germany. Ukraine's accession to the EU is considered a geopolitical necessity, but the EU must ensure compliance with accession criteria, which requires unanimous agreement from all member states. There are concerns that Hungary could sabotage the opening of accession negotiations due to concerns over the protection of the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. The biggest obstacle to Ukraine's accession to the EU is the war with Russia. It is unclear how an end to the war will be defined, and the EU's promise of support is toothless as it is not backed by military power. Ukraine's accession to NATO is only conceivable once the war with Russia has ended. Harris files paperwork putting Biden on South Carolina's ballot to kick off 2024's Democratic primary. Associated Press. Vice President Kamala Harris traveled to South Carolina to file paperwork for President Joe Biden to appear on the 2024 presidential ballot in the state. This follows a schedule overhaul, led by the White House, aimed at empowering Black voters. The change moves South Carolina into the leadoff spot for the Democratic presidential primary, a position previously held by Iowa. Biden has focused more on official visits to Pennsylvania, a key battleground state, since announcing his re-election bid in April. How Democrats' abortion ads used personal stories, attacks to win voters. Washington Post. Democratic campaigners in the U.S. have realized the effectiveness of personal stories in shifting public opinion on the issue of abortion. In the run-up to this week's elections, the Democratic Party used a mix of personal stories and attack ads to sway voters, focusing on Republicans' opposition to reproductive rights. In Kentucky, for example, the Democratic governor released a video featuring a young woman who was raped by her stepfather as a child and subsequently forced to carry his child. The woman said, "To tell a 12-year-old girl she must have the baby of her stepfather, who raped her, is unthinkable." Meanwhile, Republicans' attempts to counter the Democrats' message were inconsistent. One ad from Ohio Governor Mike DeWine and his wife acknowledged that there were divisions on the issue, but argued that a constitutional amendment went too far. Experts suggest that the Democrats' strategy paid off in the recent elections and is likely to continue into 2024. However, it may be difficult for Republicans to counter the Democrats' narrative. One observer suggested that Republicans would need to alter their policy positions to complement any new messaging. Judge Cannon keeps Trump trial date in documents case, with a caveat. Washington Post. The judge overseeing Donald Trump's indictment for allegedly mishandling classified documents has said that she could decide next year if the trial itself should be pushed back. U.S. District Judge Aileen M. Cannon said she would revisit Trump's request to delay the trial in South Florida at a scheduling conference in March. Prosecutors have argued to stick to the schedule she set earlier this year, which includes a trial in May 2024. Lawyers for the former president insisted they needed more time to prepare and said it wasn't plausible to expect them to prepare for this trial and a separate federal trial against Trump in D.C., which is set to begin in March. Why a State Department official resigned over Biden's handling of Israel. Washington Post. A former State Department official who resigned over President Joe Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas conflict said the administration's decision to send arms to Israel was an impulsive reaction built on confirmation bias, political convenience, intellectual bankruptcy and bureaucratic inertia. Josh Paul, who quit last month, said there had been a massive number of civilian casualties since then. "We continue to see precisely the sort of humanitarian catastrophe that I anticipated we would when I left," he said. Paul said there had been no senior official responsible for human rights and foreign policy during the administration. India-US strike balancing act following Blinken visit. Deutsche Welle. India and the US have held high-level talks in New Delhi, reaffirming their commitment to their growing partnership and a shared focus on the Indo-Pacific. The discussions aim to build on the momentum of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to the US in June and President Joe Biden's trip to India for the G20 summit in September. The U.S. is calling on allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific to help deter China's aggressive behavior, and is urging India to take a more active role in shaping and correcting the regional balance. Hello, viewers. I'm Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, here to bring you the latest news from around the globe. Let's dive in. First up, we have a fascinating insight into American politics. It seems that a significant portion of Americans, around 40%, believe that the country needs a leader who will break rules to fix its direction. This support for authoritarianism is a key factor behind the popularity of former President Donald Trump. In fact, 49% of respondents in a recent poll would prefer Trump over President Joe Biden. It's clear that there's a strong divide in American politics, with many people disillusioned with the current state of affairs. Moving on to Ukraine, the country's macro-financial stability is at risk due to delays in securing a financial package from the EU. This uncertainty comes at a time when Western military aid is desperately needed to counter Russia's aggression. However, it appears unlikely that such aid will be forthcoming, especially with the West's attention diverted to the new war in the Middle East. Ukraine finds itself in a precarious position, heavily dependent on U.S. military aid, but with doubts over the EU's ability to provide adequate support. Speaking of Ukraine, the country's prospects for EU accession are hindered by the ongoing war with Russia. While financial aid from the EU is not in question, there are concerns over the details and dissent among member states. War weariness and skepticism towards Ukraine's commitment to upholding EU standards are also prevalent. The biggest obstacle to Ukraine's accession, however, is the war itself. Only once the conflict with Russia has ended can Ukraine seriously consider joining NATO and the EU. In U.S. politics, Vice President Kamala Harris has filed paperwork in South Carolina to put President Joe Biden on the 2024 presidential ballot. This move is part of a strategy to empower black voters and shift the leadoff spot for the Democratic presidential primary from Iowa to South Carolina. Biden has been focusing his efforts on Pennsylvania, a key battleground state, since announcing his re-election bid. Now, let's talk about a powerful tool in U.S. Democratic campaigns: personal stories. The Democrats have realized the effectiveness of sharing personal stories to shift public opinion on the issue of abortion. In the recent elections, they used a mix of personal stories and attack ads to sway voters, highlighting Republicans' opposition to reproductive rights. It seems this strategy paid off and is likely to continue into 2024. Republicans, on the other hand, face a challenge in countering the Democrats' narrative and may need to reassess their policy positions. In legal news, the judge overseeing Donald Trump's indictment for mishandling classified documents has said that she may decide next year whether to delay the trial. Trump's lawyers argue that they need more time to prepare, considering they also have a separate federal trial against him in D.C. coming up in March. Shifting gears to international affairs, a former State Department official who resigned over President Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas conflict has criticized the administration's decision to send arms to Israel. He believes it was an impulsive reaction and has led to a humanitarian catastrophe with a massive number of civilian casualties. This raises concerns about the lack of senior officials responsible for human rights and foreign policy within the administration. Finally, we turn to India and the U.S. The two countries have held high-level talks, reaffirming their commitment to their growing partnership and a shared focus on the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is urging India to play a more active role in shaping and correcting the regional balance, particularly in countering China's aggressive behavior. That wraps up today's news. Remember, I'm here to provide you with insights and analysis from the 6 Degrees world. Now it's your turn, viewers. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any questions? Let's discuss. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.